meeting to order of the Regional Housing Mandate Committee. And would you call the roll, please?
Furman,
Here.
Coleman,
Here.
Sharp,
Here.
Schmidt,
Here.
Melissa Batten Coswell, board member, Mark Michael, PNTC,
Here.
Barb Mitchell,
Here.
board member. So 5 present, or 6 present.
Great, thank you. And this would be a time when anybody who wants to speak to an item that's not on the agenda. Do you have any? Okay. So we will enter into then the discussion of the review of the density bonus ordinance. And staff here to make a presentation.
Great. Hi.
Melissa's here.
Aaron Ackman, Interim Planning Director. Staff will have a short presentation. I will turn it over to Tim Wong, who is our Senior Planner and Housing Expert on staff.
So good afternoon all. Yes, I believe you each have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation about density bonus. So the first slide, just to do an overview of the density bonus. Density bonus offers developers to exceed the maximum density of the local zoning in providing affordable units in the development. And this law has been in effect since, I believe, the late 70s. But in 2004, SB 1818 was passed, which significantly revised the density bonus law. It increased the density bonus percentages. Previously, it was a maximum of 25%. It increased it up to a maximum of 35%. In addition, it increased the number of concessions that a developer could receive. Previously, it had been 1 concession, but it increased it up to 3. And as part of the amendment, it also required jurisdictions to codify the state law into local codes. So, and the percentage of density bonus and number of concessions depends on the percentage of affordable housing and at what affordability. And the second slide shows what those percentages are. So for example, if you provide very low income, 5% of very low income, you would be guaranteed a 20% density bonus. And if you provide 11% very low income units in the development, you would get the maximum 35%. And also there's that breakdown for concessions also, what you are eligible for to receive 1, 2, or 3 concessions. And so the next slide, concessions are there to provide regulatory relief from a local zoning requirements. By law, they are granted by right, and there are 3 very specific findings that that must be made to deny the concession. One, that the concession is not needed for the affordable rent or sales price. Secondly, it would have a specific adverse impact on historical resources, safety, or physical environment. And lastly, if the concession is contrary to state or federal law. And although we call it the density bonus ordinance, this is really about concessions. There have been some developers requesting for concessions, but no developers have requested for density, additional density. And some examples of density bonus are 801 Alma Street and also 195 Page Mill. 195 Page Mill got residential uses in the GM zone, and I think they were able to exceed their FAR for their non-residential space. And 801 was setback relief, and also they were waived for their private open space requirement. 801. So in terms of this process, it began in 2011. There was a study session with the PTC where they were shown 2 different models of density bonus ordinances. One was the San Mateo model, which was pretty much adopted verbatim from state law. And then the second one was that the PTC reviewed was the City of Santa Monica model, which was a little more refined when it came to their concessions, and they're the ones who developed this menu of concession. Based on that meeting, the PTC recommended that staff proceed in drafting an ordinance using the menu of concessions. So, flipping through to the next slide, the application process, or how to process the concession request. Staff has developed a menu of concessions that you have in the ordinance as attachment B. And if the applicant chooses a concession from that menu, those are automatically granted. No additional review is required. However, as part of the review process, if the developer does choose a concession that is not on the menu, then that is where additional review is required. And that is reviewed as part of the base application going through. So for example, if it's a rezone with concessions requested that are not on the menu, then the approving authority will review the land use application in addition to a review of the concession that is requested. In the next slide, in terms of the menu of concessions, originally staff had taken just a menu of concessions without quantification, just more open-ended, relief from setbacks, relief from daylight plane. But the PTC directed this staff to go back to quantify these menu of concessions. So in the ordinance, what you have now is, for example, a 50% relief from a side yard setback, or relief 50% relief from FAR, or excuse me, an increase in FAR that is commensurate with the square footage of affordable housing. So it is much more quantified than the previous draft. And so on the menu of concessions, we have setbacks.
Excuse me,
Sure.
I'm just informed the mics are not working in this room, so we're
Correct.
gonna have to yell.
Yell, okay.
Not yell, but we're gonna have to all speak up louder than usual so that we can be heard at all.
Okay. Now, am I speaking?
You're fine.
Okay, all right. So on the menu of concessions, those are the more commonly requested: setbacks, daylight plane, and height. And so staff has quantified some of those menu of concessions. And just to explain daylight plane, where it says a reduction in daylight plane requirements for up to 50% of the adjacent lot line, staff's intent in that is, for example, you have a side yard that is 100 feet long. Staff's intent was that they could go into the daylight plane for up to 50 feet of that side yard. There are no other, so they can intrude into the daylight plane, but there are no additional daylight planes on top of that. So that is just to clarify the daylight plane, because there have been some questions how to understand that particular concession. And also, as part of the PTC deliberations, what do we do about those concessions not on the menu? And one of the things, if you'll go back, in order to deny a concession, you must show that this request is not needed to provide the affordable price or affordable rental price. And the only way to do that is requesting financial information. Previously, there had been much discussion about should we require a pro forma if they request this off the menu, they automatically submit a pro forma. There was much PTC discussion about that requirement, and so even, what had been eventually decided that the director may request financial information to show that the concession not on the menu is, that this request is needed, but they must provide financial information for that, since that is really the only way a jurisdiction can deny a concession. And Cara is here. The next slide talks about a recent court case, Latinos Unidos versus County of Napa, and how that has affected the preparation of this draft ordinance.
New planning director should
Yeah.
Welcome, Cara.
Cara Silver, Senior Assistant City Attorney. There was a recent court decision that was handed down about a month ago, and it involved two claims in the County of Napa. The first claim was actually just a challenge to the housing element. And the County of Napa, led by our new planning director, Hillary Gittleman, actually vigorously defended that claim against a challenge to several different grounds of the housing element. And the county won in that case ultimately. Unfortunately, that portion of the opinion was not published. And instead, the second issue that was decided in that case relating to the density bonus law was the published portion of the case, and is getting all of the notoriety as being a very disappointing case for cities. And what the court ruled was that density bonus ordinances must take into account any inclusionary housing requirements that are imposed in the city's existing BMR ordinance. So in Palo Alto, we have a standalone BMR ordinance that requires a certain amount of inclusionary, affordable, deed-restricted housing units be provided in certain housing development projects. And the County of Napa case now requires that those deed-restricted units qualify for density bonus. So that has been a significant development. When the ordinance, the density bonus ordinance, went through the Planning and Transportation Commission, there was a discussion about that issue. We had noted that it was, an issue that was being litigated, and the Planning and Transportation Commission's recommendation was to draft the ordinance in a city protective way, which would not allow for the credit for the inclusionary units. But now that the case has come down, we think that it is a better approach to, recognize that case, and we have eliminated, for your recommendation, that particular provision. Just so you know, the plaintiffs in that case have actually appealed to the Supreme Court the housing element portion of the case. The Supreme Court has some additional time to decide whether to take that case up on appeal. If they do that, then the appellate court decision will be vacated. So we will be continuing to monitor this case. It's just at this point an unsettled area of law.
So if a developer meets the city's requirements, city's BMR requirements, they would be automatically eligible for one concession, and depending on the income level, but they would be eligible for at least 10% density bonus by just meeting the city's BMR requirements. So, and so that really that concludes staff's presentation. And then for the regional housing mandate to review and recommend adoption to the council.
And the one thing I'd like to add to Tim's presentation is, the question comes up, why even adopt an ordinance at the local level? There's already the state ordinance that's in effect. And I think the short story is that it puts the city in the best position legally, because without an ordinance that specifies out all the concessions that you want, the developer is essentially in the driver's seat, because they're able to claim that they need this X, Y, and Z. This is putting in the city in the position of being the starting point, rather than the developer being the starting point. That's it.
Thank you. We do have a card from one member of the public, and if anybody else cares to speak to this, if you submit a card, that would be appreciated. So Fred Ballin, and you'll have 3 minutes.
This is a big one. You may not be aware of it. You've only seen only one set of minutes in the staff report. There are 2 other longer meetings than that. This is going to ding and bang zoning. It's going to change things around, zoning and comprehensive plan, and it is going to break some nice china. 2 quickies on minor notes I just want to get out. One, in the ordinance, you may want to put in information about the second change to SB 1818, which had to do with mobile home parks and tenants in common. This is in the Santa Monica ordinance. The second thing was the court decision that related to the Vacaville case, where they wanted 40% bonus, and they got it. But then the 65915 was amended to use the words "if allowed" in the local ordinance. Whether we need that in our code or not, I don't know. I just want to mention it. The biggest china that I think is breaking is our inclusionary zoning. Whatever's left of it, by the way, because there's already been a court case that's invalidated for rental units. So you can, we've been good boys and girls here. 15% required below market rate housing in a project above a certain size. Above another threshold, 20%. Now 5% for very low income, or 10% for low income or moderate. You're in. You already get a bonus. I assume state law trumps our law. So I don't even know if a developer has to build any BMRs anymore. Maybe he just has to build 5% or 10% for moderate income housing, and that's it. And he gets the bonus, and he gets the concession, or she. And therefore, it's possible we may have an unintended consequence here. Think of the Fry site. Think of the housing that might go on there. Think of the BMR units that would be mandated by a 20% inclusionary, as it was, let's say, for the Mayfield Agreement, or for Arbor Real. Maybe they just put in 5% low income, or 10%, and that's it. And take the bonus, but we don't get all the BMRs. So think about it. I think we can't even collect we can't even require BMRs on rentals anymore. It's not clear whether we can collect in lieu fees. Can we still collect in lieu fees on homeownership BMRs? We still can. What percentage of BMRs are required in homeownership projects? Annie, is it 5%, or can you stop there? Or is it contingent on the bonus ordinance? So anyway, that's some things to think about.
And time's just basically it is up, so if you want to.
Yeah, I've written a whole bunch of stuff. This was kind of going to top level. That's the highest top level. You're going to have to look at the PTOD. It already gives bonuses. You're going to have to look at how the comprehensive plan is going, if that's allowing greater density, and then people can go on top of that. On the financials issue, the only place where you really have a chance to say, no, we don't like this concession that you've made up and brought to us that we've never seen before here, is on the case of if it's financially relevant to the inclusion of those low market rate houses. And the only way to do that is to get financials, and therefore I agree with the decision that in that particular case it should be required to be submitted along with the application and not just at the director's discretion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a second card from Herb Vorak. And we'll also have 3 minutes until the doorbell rings.
Thank you, Chair Holman, and good afternoon, committee. I request that given more time to study this and make comments. there is a new staff report. There are some changes from the previous one, but they're not noted. There's a new attachment. There are two versions of the state law there that are different from the one that was attached to the previous one. The changes are not noted, and the differences between the two versions are not noted, nor the reasons for why there are two versions there. It seems to me that in something as complex as this and as far-reaching, that the public needs adequate time to study this, and that the committee, I guess, recommend, I don't know if you can direct, that the report that goes to the council not be another version of the staff report where you have to go look for what the changes are, but rather a question and answer. That is, questions that the committee and questions that the public have raised, and with answers to them. Because you don't have a roadmap to what is here. What I can do, from what I noted, is to say, to thank staff for changing what I regard as two typographical errors from the previous version, the section number and the one word relating to the setback concession. The other things, in addition to what I had previously sent to the council, some of which may not be operative anymore after having more time to read what's here, are first on the condominium conversions, where the law requires a response to a request for concessions within 90 days. There are no standards here for what it should be. It requires a means from the city council. I believe that's something that the city council should decide rather than staff, as to what concessions would be there. In terms of senior citizen housing and qualifying mobile home parks, maybe laws for those have a number of years of affordability, but it's not stated in this ordinance in terms of how far that is. I again believe that section 18.15040E should be deleted because it conflicts with the definition of housing development, and therefore the cross-reference at the bottom of the previous page in subsection D should be deleted. Table 2 on packet page 21 uses the word concessions twice in both notes. It should be concessions and incentives. And I could go, I have more to say, but I don't have the time to do it. And so my final comment, since my time bell ran out, is that I don't think that the situations where what is essentially the director of planning community environment makes a decision in architectural review should be done essentially without any transparency or any ability to appeal them. Under the architectural review procedures that we now have, the director doesn't even have to negotiate with the ARB if he disagrees with their decisions. So it just says the director has to make a decision by the time, on the concessions, by the time that he makes a decision on architectural review. And nobody gets to see it except the director and the applicant. I think that's a lousy process. It's things like that where I think we need the time to review to find all of those kinds of things in here. So,
Okay.
thanks.
Thank you very much. So we'll first go to colleagues and ask what questions or comments you might have.
Through the chair, can make a couple clarifications from one of the speakers' questions that he had about the ordinance. Number one, the city's inclusionary ordinance still applies. So if we have a 15% affordability requirement, there's still a 15% affordability requirement. They don't get a lower to 5%, so they still have to provide that amount of housing. They do get a bonus associated with it within there, but our inclusionary housing ordinance doesn't get trumped or go away.
And to be clear, that's for sale.
Correct, and then that leads me to point number 2. Governor Brown has a bill on his desk. It's called the Palmer Fix, and Palmer was the case. What was the exact case name? Do you remember?
Palmer versus City of Los Angeles.
Yeah, Palmer versus the City of Los Angeles, where determination was made, inclusionary housing ordinances could not apply to rental housing. So hopefully the governor signs this bill, and then once again, we can have an inclusionary housing ordinance that applies to rental properties, and that issue will go away. So those were the two major clarifications that I wanted to make as we go into discussion.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Sharp?
Thanks. Oh, they don't work at all? Yes,
They're
they
still
don't.
not on.
All right, I'll
Don't
yell.
work a bit.
Just props.
So, on the broader level here, I guess I'm having trouble when I read the ordinances, knowing what's required by state law and what's within the discretion of the committee. So, I don't feel like I have enough information to recommend this to city council today, and I'm hoping we'll have at least one more meeting on this issue, frankly. So I guess I'd like to put that out there. I'd like to have some sort of a red line in this of what needs to be in here by state law and what doesn't. And I think that's very difficult for me to read this ordinance this long and know what. So I think that's the first thing. I wanted to weigh in a little bit on the pro forma issue. I absolutely agree with our speaker when he said we need that information. And I don't think that should be the discretion of the director. I think if you want a concession that's not here, I think we should go beyond that. I think not only should it be a pro forma, you should have to provide models so you can tell exactly what it's gonna look like before that concession is granted. You should have to show all those kind of things that you would wanna know as a city. You know, who knows what it's gonna be, that concession. I think we wanna know what the effect of that concession will have on our neighborhoods, will have on the people who live in Palo Alto. I mean, we have a zoning code for a reason, and I assume that what we have in our zoning code, I mean, it might be, you know, but I assume what we have in our zoning code, we have for a purpose. And therefore, when we break the zoning code for those purposes, I wanna know what the effects are gonna be. And then I definitely want the developer to tie it to the pro forma and to why they need that. And how is that really going to, you know, be more affordable? What's that criteria again, Cara? How did it say it?
Oh,
It's the,
accommodate the housing, the affordable
It's-
component of
it's-
the housing.
it's more than that. It's not accommodate, there's a financial incentive. It's gotta make it feasible. How not having that concession.
Provide for the affordable rent.
Right, doesn't make their development really feasible to provide for affordable rent. I actually think that's a pretty tough standard. I mean, I'm assuming on most of these projects that they would be okay without that, and it would still be affordable in that. And I think we need to make that a rigorous process, so that the concessions we offer here are ones that the developers, you know, can do by right. But if there's something special they want, people just don't ask for anything, they ask for what they really need, and it has to really tie to a financial incentive. And I think we need to tighten that up and do it. The other issue is we have a bunch of concessions that you've put in here. And I need some mechanism in my head to say, this is okay or this is not okay. So I do notice that you have reduction in public open space. Now that's not quantified. A lot of these other ones are. So I would want you to come back and quantify that. I mean, is it reduction in open space to
Eliminate?
well, yeah, is it a reduction in open space to 0, or is it reduction in open space by 10%? And this is public open space. So, you know, one of the things that I think we have to be fair to is low-income people. It seems that you don't want to create a really unpleasant environment with no public open space just because you're low income. I mean, I don't think we want to be building Cabrini Green here, you know? So I think we want to take this kind of stuff, and I want you guys to come back and say, you know, if we reduce the public open space by 25%, it has this sort of effect. If you reduce it by 50%, it has this sort of effect. If we eliminate it totally, it has this effect. I'm assuming we have a requirement for public open space because it's important, and in market rate housing, it creates a better quality of life. And I think we should strive to have the same quality of life in our low-income projects that we have in our market rate projects. I think, and that's why I've always liked, you know, a 15% inclusionary or whatever. And I definitely don't want the inclusionary aspects of this, the concessions, to drive the quality of life in our market rate housing and make it worse for everybody because we're doing this. So I think we want to be very careful about all of these. And that goes for the reduction in private space, the reduction in public space. in a reduction in site coverage requirement, again, I don't know what that means. We haven't quantified it. You know, and then I guess I need something on the board or something that shows me, what does a 50% reduction in the daylight plane mean, as opposed to a 10% reduction, as opposed to a 100% reduction? I just don't know, I can't visualize this at all. I have no idea what it means. So that's sort of what I'm looking for, is an understanding of what the concessions we're offering and what they really mean for the community and the environment, the as-built environment in which people will live. So I think that was my major point on this. Let's see. Just a nitpicky thing on the child care facilities, under item number, that's page 12 of the actual ordinance. I wasn't clear what under B2 really means. If you get a chance, does it mean that if we include a daycare there, and, you know, let's say there's 100 units and 20% are affordable, you know, what happens if 80 or 85 of the kids are not belonging to the affordable units? Does that mean they have to, even if there's no kids who want to sign up? Are you trying to create a preference, an equal preference? The way I read this, it says that you actually can't have more kids that don't meet the percentage. Well, that seems really silly. I mean, if you have spaces for 100 kids and you're only going to allow 70 in because you only have, you know, 10 or 15 affordable kids from in, and so you don't make the other spaces available, that doesn't make any sense to me. So I had some issues with things like that. And I was a little concerned when I read that I haven't spent enough time to analyze the entire ordinance. It's not my job. You know, that there might be other things like that in the ordinance. So I had concerns about that. Let's see, was there anything else that I had on this? Yeah, I think, now I understand the parking incentives, I assume that's in the state law, and that's drafted from that, so we can't change that.
Correct.
But is it the same with the tandem parking? I mean, do we have to allow tandem parking under the ordinance?
Right.
Verbatim.
Verbatim, I think both the childcare actually, if I'm not wrong.
Is that what it is?
Yeah, childcare, I mean, but we could do a better job, as you previously said, of stating which ones we actually
Right.
have discretion over. The concessions is pretty much the primary piece we have concessions over. The rest of it is by right.
And you know, when calculating the number of permitted density units, it says any fractions shall be rounded up to the next highest. Is that from the ordinance, or is that something we're,
State
that's
law.
state law, okay. So I think it'll be really helpful if you say what's state law and what's not, because otherwise it's really difficult to go through this. And then finally, and then I'll be done, is I was really intrigued under maximum residential density, where it says, if the development is a planned community zone, the maximum residential shall be determined on the basis of a comprehensive plan and the maximum density of the previous zone designation. Now, this made no sense to be honest. I mean, my understanding of a PC is we are passing a new ordinance that is a special zoning for the site. It seemed that this simply should not apply to a PC zone in any way. And if you want to go with the other thing, you don't get a PC zone, because council makes the decision of a PC zone all together, and you either basically decide you want the PC zoning or not. And I assume this didn't anticipate that we would sit there as council, agree to a PC zone, and then the developer comes back and says, now that you've agreed to this PC zone, we get a density bonus. None of this made any intuitive sense to me. I thought you should take out all of the language relating to a planned community zone, and it just simply doesn't apply. And if I'm wrong on this, I'd be happy to be enlightened, but it just made no sense to me. So anyway, those are my comments.
All right, thank you. And then one question for the interim director is timing on this and getting this to council?
It should, thank you, it should go up sooner than later. You know, we just had the housing element certified. We have a certain amount of time that we could get it done. I believe, how many do we have, how long do we have till after the housing element is certified?
Up to a year.
Up to to a year, but we should probably do it before that since we're rolling into our next cycle.
There
So-
wasn't much of a time constraint.
Yeah,
I wasn't
yeah.
thinking we'd sit here for a
Yeah,
year.
yeah. But we had the first planning commission discussion early 2011, so hopefully it goes a little quicker from there, from here on out.
Okay, that's good, thank you. And then, Councilmember Berman, questions,
Um,
comments?
So first, I did want to thank the Planning and Transportation Commission for putting in a little more kind of detail as to what concessions were allowed. Yeah, leaving it open-ended like the state did, which I'm not surprised, makes no sense. And at least this gives us a little bit of control over what developers can and can't get. A question, I have a couple of questions. 801 Alma, the current 801 Alma project, how, and it's tough to really get an understanding for it while construction is still underway, although it's starting to wrap up, last I saw. But what is the setback relief for that building right now? Front setback relief?
Oh, that I don't know. I know they got some type of front yard setback relief.
But we don't know if it's 25%, 50%, 75%.
No, that I
Okay.
don't know.
So
I think it was almost, I think it was greater.
Almost full.
Yeah, almost full
Okay.
setback relief.
Pretty close to the
Yeah.
sidewalk.
Okay, I'd love to know that, because I mean, that, you know, going to the mayor's point earlier, that provides a little context for us as to what these numbers actually mean. Because that I obviously don't want to revert. And so if that were 50%, I'd have a big problem with allowing 50%. If it's not, then, you know, it's a different analysis.
And one point we like to make is we also use the word average in setback rather than creating a build-to line. And I think in general, that's something that we should move towards for setbacks. Right now, we have setbacks as build-to line, so you're up to 5 feet away from the property line, and that's why you see a wall.
Yeah.
Things that cities are starting to do is they use average setbacks, so you could have some ins and outs.
And I think
of the set. Yeah.
Maybell also.
Correct, so that
Yeah.
you could have exactly, and maybe we have the average setback, that way you get some relief and you don't get that solid wall.
Yeah.
Across the frontage.
No, which is a good idea. So if there's a mixed-use proposal, so I guess someone in the staff report mentioned that 2 developers had already kind of, you know, approached the city with plans where they were gonna seek concessions. I'm gonna focus on the concessions part because clearly that's the bigger issue. Were those, and forgive me, I don't remember what those proposals were, but were those mixed use or are those just residential
They were
projects?
mixed use.
Okay.
They are mixed use.
And so if, I mean, I'm thinking of Alma Plaza, you know, if it's a mixed-use proposal, but the residences are in the back and the commercial's in the front, would that setback that they be allowed to have apply to the commercial portion as well as the residential, or would it just be for the residential?
So, I mean, the way we were thinking of them being applied to mixed use is that they'd be part of the same building itself,
Okay.
like a vertical mixed use
Got it.
product, but that could be something that we specify within the ordinance to say if it's, you know, essentially a horizontal mixed use where the commercial's in one place and the housing's in a whole another section, that, you know, it may not apply to that
Yeah.
commercial portion of it.
I mean, and I think setbacks, you know, do have different impacts based on whether or not the residential or commercial use. You get the wall of a building that you're not gonna get unless it's a multi-unit
Mhm.
building where you might, but, I mean, something to specify.
And there- Excuse me,
please.
there is that caveat that says that the setback must also adhere to design guidelines also. If it's the menu of concession setback, it has to be consistent with design guidelines also.
Gotcha.
So if it's not, then that's another consideration.
And, I mean, going back to the mayor's point a minute ago, do we have any ability to reduce the number of concessions from the 3 of the state law to 2 or 1, or, no? It's just
No,
that's preempted, and we don't, got it. I think it would have been helpful to have had the January 23rd Planning and Transportation Commission minutes, so if that's something that we could get when this comes back to us, I kind of expected to see them, but didn't. And I know I can go online and find them, but,
Easier when they're in the packet.
easier when they're in the packet. And I know the Planning and Transportation Commission kind of had a discussion of the duration of the restriction on low-income housing, and how for, I think, moderate income it was 59 years, and low income it was 30 years. And is that something that we have, would we have the ability to put a longer duration on the lower income housing? And if not, and if so, you know, is that something that?
So with Under state density bonus law, if a developer deed restricts for 30 units for the very low, they qualify automatically. However, where you do have some flexibility is in your own inclusionary housing ordinance. So if you want to, I'm not sure what our current requirement is for inclusionary housing, term,
59 years.
59
Yeah,
years.
59.
For low, medium, high, it does, I mean.
For all income levels,
Got
it's
it.
a standard 59 year.
So, you know, because of the interplay under the County of Napa case, it's likely that a lot of the density bonus projects actually will be qualifying with a 59-year term, because
Okay.
that's what's required under our own inclusionary
Okay,
ordinance.
good. Yeah, I think that's probably good for now. If I miss anything, I'll come back later.
Okay.
Thanks.
Councilmember Schmidt?
I guess just some questions of clarification would be helpful. On page 1 of the 65-915, under B1, it uses the term excluding any units permitted by the density bonus award. What's excluded on that?
Right. So, if there are 100 units and 5 of those units are, would those be the deed restricted? Or no, I'm sorry, and you get an additional, so you get an additional density bonus because you deed restricted. And so let's say the 100 units go to 110 units. The calculation is based on the original units, the
Yeah.
100, not the density bonus addition.
And what's the difference between density bonus and FAR concession? Isn't the density bonus the same as FAR concession?
Not necessarily, Councilmember, not necessarily, because you can increase the number of units, but your FAR will still remain the same. You might be able to get more units,
By making them smaller.
by making them smaller, exactly, yeah.
So the density bonus deals only
With units.
with units.
Correct. Correct.
And that's one reason why we haven't seen much requests. Rather, people ask for the incentive, which is the FAR. Parking, they were very explicit in saying what their parking rules are. What are our parking rules? How do they differ from that?
See, they're slightly different for studios and, studios is 1 1/4 units, 1 1/4 spaces per unit. 1 bedroom is 1 1/2, and then 2 bed. Is 2. 2 and above, 2 bedrooms and units. Yeah.
So we don't have any 2.5 for large.
No, if it's 2 bedrooms plus, then it's 2 spaces.
Yeah.
Yeah. But nothing beyond that.
So the only difference really is the studio,
One bedroom is one.
well,
As
in
well.
the 1 bedroom.
Yeah. Some guest parking requirement.
I guess parking is, but I
Yeah, I
think it's
think-
10%.
Yeah, it
total
also
for
does away
units.
with the guest parking requirement, which is part of our code and pretty
Yeah,
standard in other
that's
cities,
true.
and so that would trump that.
Of the 10%.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there is
so
no
that's
guest
the
parking requirements under density bonus.
And that applies to just the, it is a concession that they ask for, or it applies to all units?
The parking standards?
Yeah.
All units.
All, the entire development.
changes are base rate. Now, on page 11 of the staff report, you give an example of an incentive, and number 5 there, up to 50% can be used for an FAR bonus, which seems to restrict the FAR bonus to 50% of the units claimed. Is that right?
Are you referencing number 5 on page 11?
Yes.
No, the purpose of that is, in the FAR, they can exceed up to 50% or the amount of the square footage provided by the affordable, whichever is less. But that doesn't apply to the number of units. It doesn't apply to that.
But in a mixed-use building,
Mm-hmm.
the addition would apply only to the housing portion of it, and only to the 50% of the below market rate housing provided.
No, the increase
I'd like to see that there.
could be for either the commercial, the non-residential, or the residential. However, the developer chooses to apply that number.
So that's currently staff's recommendation. This is one of those areas where we will come back with you next time and we'll highlight, where you have some discretion. But that's one of those areas that you can modify.
And just to give you some of our thoughts on this, we've kind of gone back and forth on this one, whether it should apply to only the residential or should it allow to the commercial as well. And the reason we ended up saying we recommend that apply to any portion is that the commercial portion of it has to be parked. The residential portion of it defaults to the lower parking requirements. So if they were applied to the commercial, A, we would get smaller units overall because that FAR bonus wouldn't solely apply to the residential, and B, the commercial component that they get a bonus for would have to be fully parked, and because the density bonus law doesn't trump commercial parking standards.
I guess I'm thinking of something like the 101 proposal, which had 4 stories of commercial space and 1 story of housing, of which there was a small portion, which would qualify as BMR affordable units. Now, what we're saying is they can only increase the FAR of the size of those 3 units on the top floor. But it might be applied to the commercial side.
Correct.
Now, that puts a severe restriction on the FAR incentive, ties it directly to the affordable units that are being bought. The setback, is that similarly restricted? So if you have a top floor, which makes up, say, 1/10, the total square footage of the building qualifies for a setback unit. Does that mean the setback can only be 1/10 of what our law is? Or can they say, I want a full setback?
The way it's recommended at this point is that it's just a 50% maximum on it, so there's no proportional ratio in the same extent that there is on the FAR.
Why not?
I think the overall goal was to make these reasonable in terms of what a developer would be proposing overall. That, if we make it too restrictive, a developer's going to come in and be the starting point. So I think you have to develop something that is reasonable and could be applied in an average development. And we actually did this make more restrictive than initially, which was we didn't specify any percentage.
Average development, but where someone is using the housing concession to make a major commercial change.
Well,
is substantially different.
we could be more specific than in terms of applying the setback more to the, when it comes to the setback concession, apply it primarily to the residential component rather than the commercial component. I don't see, I mean, that could be something that we do, so it really does focus on the housing and not the commercial component.
Yeah, I think our experience with one-on-one
Yeah,
clearly
makes sense.
pointed out that these things can be historical.
Yeah,
And the setback is so important in built up areas.
that makes sense.
Someone raised the issue of the PTOD district already grants a bonus, and are we doubling down on bonuses here in the PTOD district?
Yeah, why don't we, that'll be something that we can come back to with, not as familiar with the specifics of that ordinance.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's come back to it on that one.
I support the request on financial information that rather than make that the director's discretion. And we're doing it only for items not on the menu. Is there a reason for excluding the items on the menu? Why isn't it just a standard part of the program, that it's a standard part of the law?
I guess all right, do we have that discretion for the?
We do.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it was a discussion that we had at the planning commission level. Ultimately, we said for concessions that we have within here, they would not be, but that's something at the discretion of the council as well, that you could put that in to require some type of financial information to prove the point.
Just to further on that, what our thinking is that what you want to do in this ordinance is structure it in a way that everybody agrees that there's a certain menu of concessions that we want to steer the developer towards, that they're generally acceptable. And so you want to put as few restrictions on that menu as possible.
Yeah, I can see certainly if you're looking at encouraging below market rate housing, and you have your housing developers who are trying to do that, even some of their mixed use. But I guess you do want to make clear that, and I think in most of those cases, it's going to be crystal clear that you do need these concessions to make it affordable. But there is some point at which the affordability issue becomes prominent. And I think it varies more by part town than other things. And so it's hard to prejudge in an ordinance where that is going to be an issue or not. It seems to me provide some standardization for everything that might make it worthwhile. So maybe just consider that. A point was made by one of the speakers about director's discretion being before or after the ARB, forcing the director to make a choice maybe before the ARB meeting. Was that the issue that was raised?
No, I believe what it is, ARB's decisions are recommendations to the director. So historically, I don't know of a time where a director didn't go with what the ARB recommendation was, but legally, the way our code's written right now, the director doesn't necessarily have to, go 100% with what the ARB says. So there could be a situation where the ARB recommends something, the director decides that's not the right thing to do and recommends and approves something else. So I think, and then there's not the public involvement when the director is, writing the letter at his or her desk, that there is at the ARB level.
So we're not changing that discretion that the director has?
No, that's something that's found, in other areas within our code.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it goes with the underlying, application, so, which the director has.
Good, okay, thank you.
heard a number of my questions, but so they're out there. So, one of the questions that I had is, how are we qualifying this so that an applicant doesn't come in and provide, one affordable unit at 250 square feet and qualify for concessions? That's quite a giveaway, if you will. So I want some explanation of that, and so we could require a minimum unit size. I know in other parts of our code that the BMR units are supposed to be a commensurate size with the market rate units and, not disadvantaged location, but I don't think it hurts to qualify that here as well and we reference the other part of the code, so we know we can track it back and forth. But I really am concerned about, there being great financial advantage for creating a small BMR unit, that being delivered through the way of concessions. And you wanted to say something, Aaron?
I was just gonna say, so our local inclusionary housing ordinance doesn't go away as a result of this, and it does require that the affordable units be of a similar size and shape and quality as the market rate unit. So that would still apply, but we could provide additional clarifications, perhaps referencing that section.
There is a section for development standards for the affordable units in the draft ordinance that essentially says the same as for our BMR requirements, that some equal bedroom size, same design, compatible materials, those type of things, so.
So what has, it's become quite popular that, and I'd overlooked that section, so pardon me for that. It's become popular in some communities. I mean, we read about what's happening in San Francisco and other communities where it's become quite popular to build, 300 square foot units. So if we don't have a minimum unit size built in, a developer could come along. We're all sitting there we're so skeptical, but you have to plan for the worst so that you don't allow that backdoor approach. So if somebody comes along and, wants to provide 5 300 square foot units, then one of those 300 square foot units could qualify someone for the concession. So that's why I'm looking towards a minimum square foot size, something along those lines that delivers more affordable units or more quality of affordable unit. I'll leave it to the city attorney to see if we can actually do that or craft it in some way to kind of safeguard against that. Along those same lines, we're looking for, as I've heard the comments by colleagues, we're looking for how we might be degrading quality of life here by some of these concessions and density bonus, especially concessions. Are there unintended consequences of some of our comments, and I don't expect you to answer now, unintended consequences by some of our comments and questions that would disadvantage all affordable housing and all affordable housing projects? So we need to balance that, I would think. Did you? Same thing with, okay. So on page, what's mentioned in the staff report and also in the ordinance itself, when we're talking about concessions, it says that there can't be an impact on an historic resource. But it's not clear if it's referencing the resource, if there's an addition to the historic resource itself, or if it includes the sphere of influence. And I always get that phrase wrong, but so I call it sphere of influence. So if the project that's being proposed is next door to, I'll make this up, next door to Landing Chateau or Casa Real or Stanford Theater, does this also reference protections for those buildings because adjacent construction can have severe impact on those buildings? And that's not clear here from my reading of it. So if you could come back with clarification on that. Which, by the way, I pretty much concur with all of the comments and questions that my colleagues have asked, just so that's clear. Okay, setback concessions, it's not quantified whether it's one setback or two setbacks. We have rear setback is quantified, front setback, where the other questions previous to this have kind of addressed that. But side setbacks, is it one setback, side setback, or two setbacks? And that has come up before, and why we need this ordinance is because, say for instance with 801 Alma, they wanted a setback concession and they got 3 setback concessions and it was just considered one. So, so we need to be specific here. Daylight plane, wherever that is, here it is. This could be a little tricky, but we count daylight plane intrusions in an odd way. So I guess for me, I'm not quite sure how this would be interpreted. I agree with Mayor Sharp that all of these need to be quantified. Daylight plane, site coverage, private and public open space. And I couldn't support more the notion of, you know, open space is provided for quality of life, and it's been proven over and over again and demonstrated over and over again that you need open space for health purposes, actually. But for daylight plane, the way this reads a reduction in daylight plane requirements not to exceed 50% of the length of the adjacent lot line. So does that mean a daylight plane intrusion can't exceed that, or does that mean, or different daylight plane encroachments could, you know, and also is that one side or is it 2 sides? So, because it's daylight plane, or is it 3 sides actually? Could be rear, side, 2 sides. So what does that apply to? And the reason I mentioned how we count daylight plane exceptions is because you can have 5 intrusions in the daylight plane on one side of a project, but it's counted as one if it's the same intrusion. And that's a funny way, I always thought that was a really funny way to count variances, but we do. So for me, this needs some clarification. So there's that. That one's already been addressed. Oh, yes, okay. So when these either density bonuses or the concessions are asked for, Phyllis was here. Well, I'm aware of sometimes it seems that in the last years that the Housing Corporation, who I presume will be administering these, has not been brought in early to look at where the most advantageous place is for these affordable units to be in the project. So how do we build in here, or where do we address that the Housing Corporation is brought in early and not at the back end of the project where it's like, okay, here's where we're gonna put them, sign off, which has happened too much in the last several years. So how do we build that in so that we get viable, good, affordable units that the Housing Corp is comfortable with administering and feel, you know, good about having added to our affordable housing stock? And I think those cover, in addition to the things that have been covered otherwise, I think, and you did say, well, just to make sure, so any project that goes forward, even with these concessions, still has to go through ARB and planning transportation, if it's that kind of a project, and has to satisfy the findings and all of that, so, okay, and is appealable and
Correct.
all of that, okay. All right, which one of you would like to go first? Commissioner Michael. You should be well familiar with this material, so.
So I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone may have about the Planning and Transportation Commission that wasn't prepared for the report. I think Chair Holman raised an important point about the context of the density bonus ordinance that was part of the discussion at the PTC. And essentially there's a tension between the, where a city may recognize the need for affordable housing, sort of whether and how that need is addressed is achieved through this density bonus ordinance, which is a positive. And there's a tension there between that and changing to some extent the character of the community.
which is, of course, policy number one of the housing law. So that tension is recognized. However, density bonus ordinance, to the extent that it's consistent and predictable and fair and compliant with state law, seems to be a means to address the affordable housing need. The other item I think comes up, and Mayor Scharf noted support for the request for pro forma information from developers, which at the Planning Commission has been a controversial topic, which there is no consensus. And I have a point of view, but let me try to reflect what I think are the issues. The economic feasibility of a development project may depend to some extent on what the developer expects to result in terms of their profit, what it costs them, what they get from the sale proceeds, or their net present value if they're holding it for long-term ownership and rental. And so the standard in the proposed language is to demonstrate the concession is necessary to provide for affordable rents or sales prices. Now, this issue, I think, is probably worth airing when you make your recommendation to council, not only for the density bonus ordinance, but also for the PC zone process, where the issue of the nature and adequacy of public benefits is one of the three factors that allows the council to grant PC zoning. And the concern that some colleagues have is that because of market risk and volatility, there may be sort of an unintended consequence in terms of a deterrent for otherwise desirable or needed development if the projected financial returns fall below a certain level. You know, I think those who are sort of more, I guess, insightful about the mentality of developers say that there's really a potentially very high return with a very high risk, but that you know, a risk-free return, you know, U.S. Treasury bonds, for example, is very low. Stock market average over long term may be sort of a little bit higher, but if a real estate developer expects to make, you know, 30, 40, 50% on something, and that's what the pro forma says, what standard should the council or the public anticipate would be reasonable when you get this information? So I just note that we've had that debate, have not resolved it. And my own personal viewpoint is that I would err on the side of transparency, and I think that you need data to make decisions in certain situations, and this data is reasonable to request. But however, you should be prepared to have some calibration of when the pro forma says, I need a X% return and X is a big number. There's maybe some sticker shock. Or this is a debate that you should anticipate having with the full council. So those are my two comments.
This was part of the PDC discussions at one of the earlier meetings.
It's come up a number of times.
Yeah, I mean, it would be helpful if for our next meeting, we could get the minutes from the meetings.
Okay.
And one clarification here too, maybe Aaron, you'd like to speak to this, the difference between gathering financial data and doing your own evaluation at the staff level, as opposed to acquiring a pro forma from the applicant. So do you want to speak to that?
Yes, so I mean, there's two ways that we could go about it. We could say, hey, developer, give us your pro forma, and we'll take a look at it and peer review it and see if it's all legit, and we'll see if it, you know, what if it says there's a reasonable return on investment based on industry standards. Developers are going to be very wary of that. They don't like to put that out because, you know, they're in competition with other developers. They don't like to put their secrets out there. What cities typically do is essentially reverse engineer a pro forma by using someone who's in the profession and takes forward the project and it does a pro forma for the project and puts in industry construction costs, what the sales point will be. So that's something that we could do. You know, that's something that we did for the J. Paul project, for instance. We had our consultant take a first shot at doing that. And it's something that cities have done in the past, so it's either you reverse engineer it using your own consultants or peer review an actual one from the developer.
And this is an obvious question, but, and those can be localized, you know, to various communities, or not?
Oh,
like-
yeah, they have to be.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, there's no, I mean, you couldn't use, you know, Modesto construction
Well,
costs for Palo Alto.
San Carlos or Palo Alto,
Yeah.
so just
Yeah.
wanted,
Yeah.
like I say, it was obvious, but, Board Member Mitchell or Peggy Haswell?
I have a question for you, go ahead.
I have a question about your bicycle route plan and also student yields. So, kind of thinking in terms of school impacts.
Go ahead.
Yeah, is that good? So, no, it's related to this though.
Okay.
So the PTOD is the transit-oriented development, is that
Mhm.
correct? So, this is, I think, a pretty specific question, but currently, are developers at all involved in the funding of the Safe Routes to School as a menu item that the council considers or the Planning and Transportation considers in sort of the other types of concessions?
So typically we wouldn't have something, if it was a standard zoning condition of approval, there probably wouldn't be the nexus there in order to put a Safe Routes to School, you know, condition of approval to fund. With some PCs, you know, there's the potential to extract, to take money from the PC and place it towards something, you know, for a Safe Route to School. But that's a little bit different than this ordinance itself, in that it's either a condition of approval or something associated with the planned community public benefit.
So the reason I ask is it may be valuable to have the Planning Transportation Committee and the Commission and the City Council consider, given the sort of the downtown location, Cal Avenue or try, say, the Ventura Corridor, locations of targeted development going forward, because those seem to have unique challenges in terms of routes to school right now, and because the bicycle plan may not have included those in the thinking of what we see today. I think that would be thinking and input that I think the district would appreciate from the city. The downtown locations, for example, they're certainly walkable to Addison. Some of the children are overflowed to Walter Hayes, but it's not a very friendly bike route. So as you look at other potential development in the sort of that downtown circle, that's going to be a challenge, I think, for all of us. And then again, in the Ventura Corridor, you all know there's no elementary school in there, so all the children, at least in the absence of an elementary school within that corridor, will either be crossing El Camino or Alma, as you know. So I don't know the magic solutions to that, but it is something that would benefit from, I think, your consideration as you discuss this further. The other issue is student yields. So the district currently looks in the rearview mirror to try to project student yields and development. And it seems that this is enough of a change that it may produce different incentives for developers, and it may produce notably different student yields than we've had in the past. And that type of information is also going to be really helpful for the district to have as we try to project future growth. And again, if we're to assume that a large part of the development may come in that downtown area and or the California Avenue area. So that's all.
All right, thank you.
If I could add one thing to that, this ordinance has actually been in effect since 2004 when the state adopted it. So I think we could probably look historically to see, what yields this ordinance. This is just essentially a local clarification ordinance, but the actual density bonus provisions that are allowed under state law have been in effect for 9 years now. So we could actually look back and see, what impact
very helpful. Do you anticipate that the modifications you're making will create different incentives and different student yields? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, I don't see there being much, much of a difference. I mean, there could be, it could give some developers additional certainty, which may, incent people to move forward quicker, but I don't see a huge difference in, demand based on that.
But don't tell HCD that.
Yeah.
So at the planning commission, this same issue came up about how often this may have occurred. And I think the answer was, in the last 9 years, there were none.
Yeah, there's none in terms of, there were a couple in terms of concessions, but none in terms of the density bonus themselves. So you could make an argument that projects would not have happened if there were not for the concessions themselves and that produced additional units. But in terms of the incremental amount of density bonus between 10 and 35%, people have not took advantage of that yet.
Could I have a follow-up question on schools?
Sure.
Financial impact. Prop 13 puts ceilings on reassessments. What happens to low-income housing? Do they ever get reassessed if they're under a 59-year agreement? So regardless of turnover, do they get reassessed? What rate do they get reassessed?
I know in Marin County, they get reassessed at the BMR rate. But, so every time a unit is sold, a BMR unit, it does get reassessed, but that increment is, because it's tied to the CPI, or in Marin County, it was the increase in household income. That median, it was so small, there wasn't any large jumps, if that answers your question.
Yeah, and does it make a difference if they're rental units or condominiums as opposed to residents?
Well, why don't we come back with you to get a specific answer for this area, but in general, I think the answer is the tax increases are gonna be a lot less when you have a restricted overall price than when you have something that jumps up at the same rate as the market.
Yeah, so that's an important
Yeah.
issue for the school.
Yeah, even if it was at 2%, when you're starting with the BMR rate, it's not gonna be something that moves the dial that much. But it would still be good to know. I have a question going back to Councilmember Schmidt's question about the concessions themselves and whether you want the requirements for financial reporting onto the concessions. Is there, the way the law is stated here, if you have that on the concession list as a legal concession and they meet the requirement that they get a concession, is there a way to say, oh, you don't get this concession because I looked at your financials and you don't deserve it?
If the concession is shown not to move towards the affordable housing, make a contribution to lowering the affordable housing price.
So if I'm a developer and I am going to meet the requirements, or our city requirements for below market rate housing, I don't automatically get the density bump and the concession? That's why I thought that was what you were saying before, that you automatically get a concession.
Correct.
So there's a list of concessions here that are allowable, not the other one, but the allowable one. And I submit my financials to you with that. I mean, if you ask for financials, can you then say, oh, you can't use that one? I mean, it's a list of what's allowable. Don't you get any of the allowables if you're
Right.
allowed to have one?
Yes, and so I think that Councilmember Schmidt was suggesting that perhaps we look at that structure. And certainly you have the discretion to change that so that you don't get, currently the state law says that, you have to get these concessions for any, automatically, unless you have an ordinance. So once you have an ordinance, you have some flexibility on setting it up.
So we could actually put an ordinance in place that would give discretion to the council or planning commission as to which concession you could use, even if it was on a menu of concessions.
Yes.
Interesting.
I actually have a follow-up to that. So I think that it's a good point is, given, let's see, that the Palmer decision gets overturned, we put 15% back for rental housing. That means that every housing project that comes forward is entitled to one concession, right? Does that also mean that the parking requirements you've set forward here becomes the actual parking requirements regardless of what our code says? For all, assuming everybody does this because we require it, then does that mean that this becomes our code for all housing projects?
Well,
Is that really what happens?
you know, I mean, it may be that the market rate units don't, you know, collect as much rent if they're under part. So I don't know that is a.
Well,
something you
but
can
legally,
rely
they
on.
have a choice. The developer
Yes,
can always
exactly.
provide more parking.
Yes, yes.
So what you're really saying is that our code goes away and that this becomes the minimum for all housing projects if we institute 15% across the board, low-income housing, right?
Well, we already have the 15%.
Well, we have,
Yeah.
well, yeah, we can always
Yeah.
change it. We have it on for sale. We don't have it on rental. Assuming the Palmer decision changed, we then have to, I don't know if it's suspended currently or whatever,
Yeah.
right, but it would come back. But then I think what we're really saying is that the parking requirements here become our new code parking de facto because all housing meets it, and if all housing meets it, that becomes our code. And I just want to know if that's what you're saying.
Everything over 5 units.
Yeah, everything over 5 units. So anything under 5 units has a different parking requirement.
They have to request it, though. They have to request that concession.
No, I don't think so.
No, that's
It's not a
not a concession.
concession. It doesn't. It looks to me like that's what happens. And so I guess I wanted to know, you automatically get the density bonus, right, if you want it.
Right.
So so RM15 goes to roughly RM20 automatically across the board on all of our stuff. And RM30 goes, I'd have to do the math. So if that's gonna be true, then maybe we need to look at RM15 should be RM10 and RM30 should be RM25. I'm just saying, if that's what we wanna do, I mean, we should look at this holistically and say, and maybe we're fine with everything being RM20. I'm not saying I'm not. But I mean, I think we have to realistically look at this and say, what is the effect once we codify this? And not to kid ourselves and still call it RM15. I think that's what we're getting.
So isn't this just for affordable units?
The parking? The
No.
parking requirements would apply to the entire project.
Right, but it's only for projects that include affordable.
But they all do. We require it.
Right, right.
Every
Only
project
if they're over a certain size.
If they-
over 5 units, come
Over
on.
5 units,
If
yeah.
they paid the in lieu fee, they would not be
And
subject.
we
So-
haven't been
so-
seeing a lot of these
That's a good point.
projects in the
Yeah.
rental
That's a good point.
arena because the Palmer decision has essentially suspended our ordinance, and so we're not requiring inclusionary housing units. But with this new state law, which will be challenged, and it's not entirely clear whether it will be a
Will go into
Palmer,
effect.
whether it will be a Palmer fix, and there will be some litigation over it. So, you know, these things are still evolving.
And I thought
And you were
Tim
saying,
had a good.
Tim?
But if the developer pays the in lieu fee, then they would not be eligible for density bonus concessions because there's not the in lieu fee option, so.
So it definitely creates an incentive for actual production of affordable housing versus just paying it in lieu.
So is there any, it sounds like there's no discretion about the different parking standard applying to just the VMR units. That's not anything we
Correct.
have discretion over.
Correct.
That's
The-
the state law.
Yeah, the three major components, parking, we have no discretion. The actual density bonus percentages, no discretion. Concessions, we have discretion.
Yes?
I just want to say, I agree with a lot that's been said today, but I do also want to take a step back and just remind myself and maybe others, we do want to encourage affordable housing, and that is what this is meant to do. And so it is a fine balance between encouraging developers to build more affordable housing, you know, in projects that they're currently planning versus, I mean, as Vice Chair Michael said, that balance between encouraging this affordable housing that we need in Palo Alto and protecting, the look and feel and quality of our neighborhoods. And so I think we focused a lot today on the protecting the neighborhood, and I think that's right, but we don't want to make it so onerous that developers just say, forget it, I'm not going to go through that hassle. And now we're losing out on opportunities for affordable housing that I personally think we need. So it's, not to get into specifics, but let's just keep that in mind as we move forward, that it's a balancing act.
Can I ask a little bit, Holman?
Yes.
Just a clarification on what you just asked. I'm not sure I understand what the benefit would be to have different parking standards for BMR units than for market rate units. Is there some reason for thinking that there should be different?
Well, the parking standard that could be applied for as a result of the density bonus law would change downward the parking requirement for the market rate portion. So as we have parking issues in this community right now at considerable levels, it could exacerbate that concern.
So your question is, how do you mitigate a reduction in parking requirements? That's what you're talking about
Mhm.
here.
Right,
Okay.
exactly.
It's not that you think that there's a difference in the number of cars or something.
No, not at all. So I sort of alluded to this earlier in thinking about unintended consequences. And so since Councilmember Berman just made his comments, is there any, I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there any workaround to this so that if the City of Palo Alto adopted an affordable housing overlay or an affordable housing zoning, do we get any kind of workaround, could that qualify for a concession? Can we talk to our, we have a meeting with Rich Gordon, maybe we can talk about that, but is there any kind of workaround so we're not discouraging affordable housing, but we're really getting at what we want to get instead of these other consequences that we could get if people apply for a lot of these concessions? We talked about this at the Planning Commission like years ago, you may remember.
Right.
And we didn't get forward with that.
Right, and we talked about it in terms of the housing element as well, and that certainly is something to consider with the housing element, but at this point, state density bonus law is the law, and we're just preempted in this area, and as of right now, affordable housing overlay would not relieve us from the requirements of state density bonus law.
So perhaps it's something we should talk to our legislators about. So for instance, instead of getting one more unit here and maybe 2 more units there, that we really talk about how to concentrate those development concessions and density bonuses onto all affordable. So it's like a concession and density bonus TDR, so to speak. But right now, that sounds like that's not something that is applicable, but perhaps we should work towards that. Any other questions or comments? And does staff feel like we have given you a lot of comments and questions?
It's doable, we took good notes.
Okay, because it's not recorded.
That's good.
Yeah.
No. Motion? And-
Well, I guess I would follow up on the request that this be returned to staff to come back to us at our next meeting, taking into account the comments made today.
Comments and questions?
I'll second.
Okay, any other comments? I would just say comments and questions. Does it clarify the motion? Okay. All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, that passes unanimously. With that, is there anything else anybody needs to talk about in terms of future agendas besides me? Okay, so on a future agenda, this supplanted it, but on a future agenda, Aaron, you want to take it?
Sure, so, Chair Holman and I have been talking about and this has come up at the council and at the commission level too, but taking a look at what impact the approval of office development has on housing quotas and regional housing mandate allocations. So this is something I've had preliminary discussions with ABAG about, but I'll have more detailed discussion with them and be able to bring something back to the committee.
And do you know when you might be able to bring that back? So this will come back at our next meeting, and do you think you might be able
Yeah, I
to
think
also bring that back?
Yeah, let me, we just had a new regional rep start for Santa Clara County, but I think we can get something set up pretty quickly.
Thank you very much. Anything else, Councilmember Schmidt?
A follow-up to that and to the discussion today. Last housing element had about 50% of the units in the area of Ventura School neighborhood. And will obviously be heavily impacted by this. I think the office development going on around town is pushing more dense housing into specific targeted neighborhoods, which is where maybe having a demographic discussion could be a play on this, but I think it is one of the impacts that is flowing out of this set of decisions.
Consider that and look at the next agenda. Yes, Board Member Mitchell.
I'm not sure I have the schedule of future meetings. Is that out yet?
What's the date of the next one?
It was released yesterday.
What, do you know what it is?
It's the second Thursday of each month, is that?
Yes.
So
So it would be the
Thursday,
10th.
including all months?
Oh, October
So it'll be
10th?
Yeah.
October 10th.
I'd actually ask that we do it on a different day, because me and the city manager are gonna be out of town.
That's the best day to get things done.
That's right, that's right. Well, we need to give staff enough time to compile all this information. Are you, well, let me ask it this way. Are other persons at this table available on the 10th? And no disrespect to the mayor, but is everybody available on the 10th except for the mayor? And then on the, would you prefer the 3rd or 17th?
I'll be out of town on the 3rd, so the 17th.
Okay, the 17th, is everybody available for that? So first is,
I prefer the 24th. I'm out the 17th too.
well, you're just a problem case, aren't you?
I don't know, I have a busy schedule as the mayor.
The global mayor.
Yeah, okay. So.
I don't mind
I
a
need,
diff-
I need to do this, so, different day, we could look at a different day. Maybe, you know what, let's do a doodle.
Okay.
Let's do a doodle, okay? And do you want to initiate that?
Sure. I'll have
Okay.
Zaria send it out.
I'm sorry?
I'll have Zaria send out a
Okay,
little bit.
all right, perfect, thank you very much. That would be helpful. I want to thank all the members of the public who came and those who spoke, and to all of you who participated in this, and thank you for your input.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Meeting
All right.
adjourned.